joined the Navy at 17, 11th of March 1942. After a few weeks of training, I was appointed to HMAS Castlemaine, which now is a museum ship at Williamstown. Yeah. It's a ship that was survived and taken over by a very interested group. They love me because the occasions I've gone down there is that I'm attracted. I'm the only survivor of the original crew. And I had a good job. I'd come up a little bit. Then I felt sick. I went to the sick berth attendant. He sent me ashore to hospital with chicken pox, could you imagine? So I was stuck there. When I came back to join my ship, it had gone. Oh. So the next ship, I went to another corvette, Bunbury, HMAS Bunbury, and we did a stint north in that. But then out of the blue, somehow, I know what happened. I got a draft to go all the way south from north of New Guinea to pick up a ship which was undergoing refit at Williamstown, the destroyer Napier. Mm-hmm. I'd gone from corvette, which was the lowest, sort of a warship, to a crack destroyer. Mm-hmm. And from there we did a stint off India and Ceylon, based at Trincomalee, which was north of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And then we went through the Burma campaign successfully, carrying troops and then supporting them with our ship's guns. Mm-hmm. That was continued successfully. And then we had a hurried trip home to make a few alterations to the ship and then join up with the British Pacific Fleet, which was operating off the coast of Japan. We were based on Darwin and escorting ships across the Armidale Sea and also doing supply runs to places along the coast, such as Milingimbi and Wyndham and a few other places. And slow 5-knot convoys, see, they were using old supply ships that were outdated. They'd belonged to the previous century and their speed was about 5 knots. Mm-hmm. On one occasion, one of the ships was bombed by a Japanese plane and our captain was trying to speed them up. I can remember Castlemaine turning and coming up very slowly alongside the James Cook with this old coal-burning slow thing, and I could see the great big screw at the stern turning in the water like that. And as we came up alongside the bridge, Captain Sullivan called out to "What is your best speed, mister?" The answer came back, 5 knots, we're doing it. Yeah. That's what it was like, backwards and forwards across the Armidale Sea. We also were with that sad supply jobs that sank the Armidale. We're in company with her. She was to deliver troops and goods. We were to pick up 70 survivors, 70 refugees. We managed successfully to get our refugees. I won't go into that story other than the fact that we got them on board, but we'd been chased by the Japanese all the way, and we were miles out, hours away, and couldn't. When we got to the place, the bay where we were to meet and unload, there was no sign of anything. And we then turned to come back to Australia. The Armidale was unable to finish her job or even to do her job, but we needed to get away. About mid-morning, and we'd been attacked by Japanese planes. There was a signal came from Darwin for the Armidale to turn round and go back and deliver their job. And no hope. There was a signal came through at one stage where you're only experiencing second-rate warfare. By that time, the Armidale was on the bottom. Corvettes should never have been used. 10-knot, 12-knot ships to go up unarmed vertically, because the Japanese planes always came from astern to bomb the ships, and their gun was on the forecastle. That's no, couldn't. Darwin was a mess. There was not a single undamaged vehicle, building in the place. It was just a mess. We tied up to the remains of the long pier, and the only thing that was linking the two broken halves of it were the railway lines that's still there. The rest of it was broken away with a Neptune, a 10,000 ton ship lying on its side alongside the wharf where it had been bombed. But I didn't experience the initial bombing of Darwin.
No.
But we did every time it was a moonlight night, the Jap planes would come over and do some bombing, mainly to the airport though. They didn't. There was nothing left in the harbour in the way of any important ships, and the harbour wasn't. Harbour was fairly well left untouched.
Okay.
But the first of the bombing, of course, that was disastrous. When I joined the Castlemaine, I joined it on my own and knew no one when I got there. And that was the pattern set for every ship I went to. Always seemed to go on my own and not knowing anyone. In this case, and I was a boy, of course, and scared, never been to sea, didn't know a thing. But I went aboard this ship and I found there was no locker. All the lockers, there were more crew numbers than lockers. So I had to live out a kit bag, just an ordinary bag. And that was, only stowing place for that was in the hammock bins. So that had to stay in the hammock bins, could only be accessed after 10 o'clock at night. It was hopeless. I couldn't even have a toothbrush, because if you left anything out, it immediately was taken out. You weren't allowed to. It was put into the scran bag. And if you talk to your father, he knows what the scran bag was. Right. There was one seasoned sailor who'd been in the Navy from the beginning of the war, and he'd served on the flagship of Australia, but he was drafted off the flagship to the Castlemaine. And unusual, it was not done for a seasoned seaman to have anything to do with a useless recruit. He offered me a corner of his locker for the little bit of stuff that I had, shaving gear, combs, toothbrush and so on. And that started it. Now, he was an orphan and he didn't have anything ashore. He had all his worldly possessions were in that locker, right? And yet he allowed me a corner of it, right? He developed a friendship, which he went to different ships and so did I, but we met up through the war. Crew members would unload, for instance, drums of oil and fuel and so on. They were tied together in a long string and pulled ashore by a motorboat as far as you could go. And then you know what the tide situation is in Northern Australia, huge variation.
Oh, okay.
Then at low tide, those wretched full drums would have to be rolled up through the mud till they got to high ground. And at the time, part of the time, I was captain of the motorboat. That was a good job. You got away from the ship a bit, and our motorboat was used in pulling these rafts, and also we also carried landing boats, things that could sort of semi-collapsible things, and they were loaded with various goods and towed as far as they could go, and then the contents had to be lugged. Usually they were taken in at high tide, so they could get to the sand and out of the mud. And the longer a ship served at sea, well, the food ran out. Now, until we got some refrigeration in the Castlemaine, we had tin butter. That was okay until you opened it. It was liquid. Could you try that? Always short of something. If you had enough tea, you had no sugar to go with it. If you had plenty of sugar, it was because you'd run out of tea.
Right.
Clothing was the same situation. People, it might have changed, but the Army and the Air Force were supplied with clothing. And when a short shirt or shorts or something wore out or developed a hole, they were passed in for a new pair. Not the Navy. Sailors had to provide their own. They could buy them from stores ashore where they had them, or from big ships which carried stores, but you could never get this. Small ships could never get supplies because you weren't ashore near a store to get the supplies, and your clothing wore out, particularly in Darwin. I can remember on one occasion the engine room and boiler room people needed cleaning rags, and they would come, ex-Air Force and ex-Army torn clothing, would come ashore in a wool bale, right? And they would have a plentiful supply. I can remember one bale coming and dumped on the after deck of the Castlemaine, and the sailors descended on it like floes, like crows round a carcass. To the dismay of the engine room and boiler room staff, the sailors got in and pulling this stuff. Some pair of shorts only needed the stitching, a shirt with only half a sleeve. That was okay. And a sailor who badly needed a pair of shorts, I got a bit of stuff out of it, but I wasn't too badly off. But I watched some other sailors, and they'd grab something, oh, this might do. They'd retire out behind the crowd, drop off the shorts, drop off the ragged ones, put on these replacement ones, and throw their dirty old worn-out shirts back in the wool bag. So we reckoned the engine room staff only they got back what they was a good exchange. Now that gives you some idea of the supply conditions, and the food wasn't much different. It was ordinary all the way along. I was friendly with Iran when I was in Flinders Naval Depot for a course. She was a relative of mine, and I met her 2 or 3 times. I kept telling her I was sick of these 10-knot convoy leaders, corvettes. They were the lowest form of naval power. I kept telling her I wanted to go to a destroyer. Months later, as I explained before, that I received that change from the ship north of New Guinea all the way down to Victoria to join up with the destroyer. When I met up with her again, I said to her, well, she worked in the drafting office, I said, did you have anything to do with that draft of me from New Guinea back to the Napier? No, no comment except you wanted to go to the destroyer, didn't you? That was an interesting time. We met up with terrible weather in the typhoon period and so on, but I loved rough weather. I felt the ship was living and I was living too, because even though it was dangerous, there had to be very bad weather. You were kept off the main deck because you could be swept overboard. And on one occasion I nearly was, but that was on the way home. The job was completed and we came home escorting the aircraft carrier Formidable, which was joining up with the British fleet. And the big wigs didn't want the N-class destroyers because they were short range, designed for around England. But because of their war record, and Captain Buchanan, who was the captain of the flotilla, we got sent up north and with the fleet. The British Pacific Fleet was the most powerful fleet that England had put to sea. For the next few months we operated off the coast of Japan, or the lower islands of Japan, and putting up with kamikazes. And I'll show you a photograph of the Formidable after she had a bad attack with a kamikaze. The ship was 800 feet long, and as I watched in absolute amazement as the ship virtually exploded, and it was flames hundreds of feet high for the 800 feet length of the ship. And then she turned into the wind to keep the flames away from the tower, and all you could see was black smoke, which after a few minutes that seemed to mostly disappear. Then we could watch the cranes dumping the kamikaze plane came down and ignited all the planes on the flight deck in one monstrous bonfire. But the ship had some of the planes in the air, and they had nowhere to go, did they?
No.
Within half an hour they'd cleared the rubbish off the flight deck and they were landing their aircraft. Just amazing. The fleet was ringed with 24 destroyers, of which 2 of them were N-class destroyers, and the Nizam and the Napier. And the other N-class destroyers, plus others, were with the fleet train, which was a system devised by the Americans to cover the distances, because they had hospital ships, fuel ships, supply ships, all hundreds of miles out into the ocean and surrounded by its own fleet. When the actual fleet needed provision, we moved out towards met up with the fleet train and took on supplies, and an ingenious method of shifting people from ship to ship if necessary, never stopping. That last cruise was 49 days, in which time the engines didn't stop. Even with the church service, the Thanksgiving service that was put on the board Napier, the ship was still travelling. There was one big Jap battleship right in the middle of the middle of Tokyo Bay. Unbelievable. But on closer inspection, it was a burnt out, no crew left aboard battleship. The only one that was still afloat was only afloat because they'd rammed it onto a sandbank before it sunk. So I looked at the ships. It was hopeless trying to make a count of them. They were everywhere, right? A few days later, I got the official record. That was, I thought there must have been, 300 or so ships. There were 370 warships in Tokyo Bay. Captain Buchanan, with a part of the ship's crew, went ahead to the Yokosuka Navy base, which was part of Tokyo Bay, and he was given the job of representing the combined British and Australian forces, and he took the surrender of the base. After that, we moved our ship out and anchored about 100 metres or more away from the battleship Missouri, and we watched the signing of the peace, which was a long, drawn-out process. I got sick of watching it. It was rather boring. It was quite interesting and a point of discussion among the ship's crew, and that was that we knew the big wigs from Canberra wanted desperately to get up there, and they would take the case of the surrender, but they were too far away. They didn't have aircraft to fly that distance. They did have the repaired cruiser Hobart, and they came rushing up in the Hobart, but they were too late. Captain Buchanan had done the job. We moved out and anchored a few days before the signing of the peace. Might have been a couple of days, I don't know. As I say, we were fortunate enough to anchor within a short distance to be able to see all the goings on the battleship Missouri. But after a while, the toing and froing of every representative of every nation, including Russia, every nation that could had their representatives there, with the big wheelers and dealers making a noise for themselves. I weren't very interested in that, but it was interesting to see there were 2,000 crew members on the Missouri, and they were even sitting on the great guns. How they sat there straddling those guns there for hours, I don't know. I lost interest. You could only, you couldn't hear what was going on, of course, but you could see every so often some big wig would walk up to the table with a sign and sign the thing and walk away again with a great show of pomp and so on. Take a 24-hour or a week or a month and so on. 5% was danger, 5% was interesting, 5% more was that put out with day, night and night watches. As you know, with your father being in the Navy, that you had the night watch, the middle watch, the morning watch, and so on. And that went round and round the clock. There never round of watches. So a sailor developed the ability to go to sleep at any time in any condition. Mm-hmm. And we slept on the ordinary steel deck because it was too hot to sling a hammock. Right? You slept on tables, on the floor of the deck, underneath the tables. And as I explained before, or started to explain, we lived over the oil tanks. Just forward of us was the engine room, boiler room, right, just through a thin bulkhead. Just a little bit further down below was the ship's magazines, which could have blown to pieces, right, and just behind us was the main part of the engine room that propelled the ship, right. So you were living in, and as I explained to you, living with batteries. It was mostly boredom. After a while you'd read everything you could. Fortunately, I did in any of the ships I served in, I didn't experience anywhere where there was upheaval and fighting.
Mm-hmm.
If there was any, I wasn't aware of it. We lived to respect each other, but lived very quietly. For example, you did not admit to having a birthday, anything foolish like that. And I had my 18th, my 19th, 20th, 21 and 22nd birthdays in the Navy. And I'm always amused at so much fuss and people put on with every birthday that's going. But I never experienced any.
Okay.
So, and I'm no worse off for it. Problem was the ships were designed before World War II. They were designed when there was virtually no anti-aircraft armour,
that's right.
except machine guns. And every time an extra gun or whatever was put on the ship, it required extra sailors. Radar came into view, and that was put on the ship. That required extra servicemen. And the normal peace complement for those ships was 180 men. We had, because we're flotilla leader, they carried more people to serve as part of the deal. Now in the Napier, the galley, the kitchen, was about the size, maybe less in size for that. It was a great big oil-fueled range that I started cooking the roast early in the morning for lunchtime. And as soon as the meat was burnt on the outside, it was taken out and put in a hot locker, and another lot put in the stove, because that stove was preparing food for nearly 300 men. Right? Conditions weren't too good. At the back of this big stove, there was a big water tank, and that was there for heating water for tea. Right? Besides that, it was used as a receptacle for heating up the vegetables in tins. So the tinned vegetables were hung in there in string bags in the hot water. And when they were taken out and opened up, they had hot vegetables. We also had dehydrated potatoes, and that was the start of dehydration of that sort of food. And it tasted like nothing on earth. It sure didn't taste like potatoes. Yeah. And just back to the Napier. Yep. You got your supply of roast. You got your two or three cans of vegetables. You took them back to the mess deck, and if you were on duty, that you put out the food, and you had to cut the roast. The first two slices were burnt. The next two slices or so were all right. The next ones, for the rest of it, was raw. Okay. Because they had to cook it in such a short time. The cooks did a marvellous job. I had a fairly lonely life in the Navy because I have a resistance to alcohol, right? In much as in hot weather, I could take a glass of beer, oh, that's fantastic, right? I couldn't drink a second one, it's like drinking lemonade. To me, yes. I could no more drink alcoholic than I could continue to drink lemonade or water, with the result that I usually went ashore by myself, because if I went ashore with a group of shipmates, they'd want to stay in a hotel and drink there until it was time to go back to the ship again. Because you've got to understand the conditions that sailors lived under. They wanted a bit of release, a bit of freedom. Occasionally, in a place like Melbourne, one of the crew members goes, "Are you going ashore tonight, Andy?" "Yes." "Oh, can I come ashore with you?" "Yeah, sure, as long as you don't expect me to get stuck into some hotel somewhere, because I won't go." "Right? No, I've met a lovely girl and I want to meet her tonight about 8 o'clock and I don't want her to think that I've been drinking." Okay. So I kept a few blokes sober. But it was a lonely time because they'd go ashore and they'd release all that pent-up energy in the nearest hotel, where I didn't have any use for that. It was an experience that I was very glad to get, but it's not one that I would try and force on someone else. I experienced the sea as in every condition that you could imagine, because we lost 2 sailors in Back Strait, spilled overboard. We found that the sea was as placid as a lake. When something thrown over the side would cause ripples. Also, we also experienced when the ship would plough its bows under the waves with a fierce sea, and spray would fly right over the top of the ship and encrust the mast in salt. Right. And that the sea taught me a lot of things. It taught me that you could see the actual curve of the earth over there. Yeah, that was interesting. I tried to be interested in everything that was going, learn lots of things I didn't learn. But as I said, it gave me the opportunity to see other places and learn how other people lived. And even though the near 5 years was largely boredom, I experienced a lot. And I experienced, I say, the ship under dangerous conditions, where you went down in your mess deck when you're off duty and you laid down to sleep on that steel deck on top of the oil tanks, next door to the magazine and the steam in the engine and boiler rooms, and you went to sleep, accepting the fact that your shipmates on duty would be watchful and be prepared to help you survive. And in all that time, as I said to you before, I never experienced any fighting or any arguments, because they were very private. You had to be private, and you had your own particular friends, as when this fellow I spoke about, who offered me a corner locker, we used to meet up at every opportunity when our ships were in the same place. It wasn't many occasions, but then you were free to talk about your own personal feelings. But otherwise, you kept them to yourself. So it was a case of lots of your thoughts and ideas of being compressed inside, because you had to live with those people in very, very tight conditions. You'd have to experience it, but that was what it was like. When we, on the Burma campaign, we'd pick up 400 British soldiers with all their equipment, and they would be stowed in various parts of the ship. We would have to leave our mess decks and live on the ship, not in the ship. And that's another point I've always referred, and a true sailor refers to the ships as living in it. As I say to people when they say, what it was like on board a ship. We didn't live on a ship. You don't live on houses, do you?
No.
You live in a ship. Something that there's such a variation, and you would know something of it, and that is that a way of life at sea is totally different to a way of life on land. It always has been, and I think it always will be, and that needs to be accepted if the two come together. It's like what Kipling wrote when he stated, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet.